On November 30th, 2021, 55 years after attaining independence from the United Kingdom, Barbados is poised to take the final step on the road to republic. Welcome to Road to Republic. I am Miles Eversley.
And I'm Rashid Best. This series documents the views of our people, including historians, political scientists, and state officials. We will discuss our history, our current system of governance, the way in which we transition, and previous efforts to transition to Republican status, both in Barbados and across the region.
Well, Rashid, it is important that we begin by placing things in historical perspective. But before we do that, we must ask, what exactly is a republic? Ambassador to CARICOM, His Excellency David Commission, leads the discussion, providing an answer to that recurring question.
A republic is basically a form of governance in which it is acknowledged that sovereignty resides in the people and that all power, all official authority within the society or within the nation must ultimately come from the people as expressed in elections and other forms of democratic decision-making. So this could be easily contrasted with, say, a monarchy, where power comes from family background, some aristocratic family, and simply based on one's membership of this quote-unquote special family, one is automatically invested with power and authority. A republic says no, it is the people who are the source of power and authority, and therefore whoever holds power within that nation, you must be able to trace that power right back to the consent of the people. That consent usually expressed in some form of election.
People that are pro-republic, a lot of them would be saying that it is about time that we got there. Across the Caribbean, I don't think there's much resistance at the level of political leadership to go into a republic, but it's a difficulty in making the cultural step. And people tend not to be too eager about making that step unless it's a thrust. And you don't have a movement that is thrusting them in that direction to say, do it now. But this thing was up almost from the time of independence. I think that Mr. Barra, knowing how he was talking at the time of independence, he had a Republican view, but I think he followed the guidelines that had been established 4 years before in Jamaica, where the least resistance to the transition from colony to independence was taken, where Norman Manley, the father of Michael Manley, said that the best thing to do in the transition from colony to independence was not to disturb the people with institutional changes that was beyond their socialization, so that it would be best to make the transition as minimalist as possible. And consequently, we were lucky that we had a system that we could use in any event that could be taken from the British. And he said all that would happen is that the morning after independence, people would wake up and would be a governor general as distinct from a governor. That was the best way to go. Now, my view would be that we could have done it ever since, and we would be much further along the line of procedural governance changes now than I think we would be prepared to do in an immediate sense at this stage.
Dr. George Bell is resolute in his views that it should have been done many years ago. And to better understand his position, we look back in time to fully understand the 17th and 18th century politics of Barbados, where the masses had little say in the way in which they were governed.
So if we look at the history of Barbados, let us begin with the brutal reality. Barbados was a slave society. So in a slave society, that is the quintessential society in which power is not based on the people, on their consent. Because for most of our history, the the majority of the people of Barbados, the black people of Barbados, were divested of all power. They were enslaved. Secondly, Barbados began in 1627 as a privately owned territory. If you remember the early history of Barbados, these proprietary grants that were given to Courtine and to the Earl of Carlisle by the English monarch, and ultimately the Earl of Carlisle was the one invested with the grant, and so he became the Lord Proprietor of Barbados, who owned the territory of Barbados. And so the early development of a society here in Barbados was, again, even from the perspective of the white slave-owning class, it was the opposite of a republic. It was where ownership and power was vested in this one man. But very early on, an interesting thing happened, because even though the Lord Proprietor, in theory, had all the power, by 1639, his governor, Henry Hawley, who he had invested with some power as governor, felt constrained to establish a House of Assembly. He felt constrained to summon a number of what he called the freeholders. This would be some of the leading planters of the day, to constitute a House of Assembly that would carry on the functions that we associate with an assembly. He initially simply appointed them himself, but very soon after, they established appointment through elections. But of course, elections of the planter elite, a very restricted franchise. Slaves totally excluded, the enslaved black people totally excluded, women totally excluded, and even most of the white population excluded. So very restricted. But you know what is interesting? When Barbados established that House of Assembly in 1639, there was no functioning parliament in Britain. Britain had gone through in the 1630s this contest between King Charles I and the Parliament of England, contesting over power, who should be more powerful, and the king had dismissed the Parliament. So for the decade of the 1630s, England did not have a functioning parliament. So one of the ironies of history is that when the House of Assembly of Barbados was established in 1639, there was no parliament functioning in Britain. And then we go forward into the 1640s. We all know about the English Civil Wars, the battle between the king and parliament that ultimately ended in the king being executed. The parliamentary forces won the Civil War, and in 1649 executed the king and established parliamentary rule in Britain. So Britain, in a sense, became a republic in 1649. The British Parliament then declared that the colony of Barbados was a republic. However, the white population, the white ruling class in Barbados had other ideas and declared that they were going to continue to recognize the son of the executed king, King Charles II. That then led to the Republic of Britain sending out a fleet to subdue this rebellious colony of Barbados that still wanted to recognize monarchy. And there was the war, basically we can say a war between Britain and Barbados. 1651, the Barbadians sued for peace. In early 1652, the two sides negotiated, and they came to an agreement called the Charter of Barbados. And again, what was unique about that is in that Charter of Barbados, the Barbadians insisted that there must be no taxation without representation. They insisted that the British government could not impose taxes on Barbados unless those taxes were consented to in the Barbados House of Assembly. Now, again, bear in mind, this is a very Republican principle, because this is a principle that says you can only impose taxation if the people consent. But bear in mind, when they said the people, when they talked about the Barbados House of Assembly, the Barbados Parliament, again, not the mass of enslaved black people, not women, a planter elite. And so Britain became a republic between 1649, when the king was executed, and there was no more any king in Britain, until 1660, when Cromwell died. The republic that he had established floundered. And intriguingly, during that period of the 1950s, Cromwell abolished the parliament, basically abolished the parliament in Britain. So Barbados had a parliament, a House of Assembly. Britain abolished the parliament and in a sense became a dictatorship. So that is just to sketch a little bit of the background of our flirtation with Republican ideals. Britain in 1660, the son of the executed king, Charles II, was reinstated, and Britain resumed as a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy where between the king and the parliament they shared power. And that became Barbados' fate as well. So Barbados likewise reverted to being a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, but obviously very much controlled by the English colonial governors. House of Assembly, still restricted, had a little power.
The colonial experience with governmental forms actually gives us the opportunity to look at different types of approaches to the running of Barbados over the years. We started out with the system almost like a gift system from the king, the proprietorship system. And then we move to a level where ideologically the persons settled in Barbados felt that they were Englishmen overseas and should have the rights of Englishmen. And they would have contributed then to a system that was in place in other parts of the British Empire, to the development of what came to be called the old representative system. In a sense, there was very little that was representative about it, because very few people elected the people that went into the lower house of that government, the lower legislature, the House of Assembly. Very few people elected the people to that lower house. The upper chamber, the Legislative Council, had in the bigger and more experienced planters and the colonial officials. And of course, the Parliament would have included then the governor. And the governor ruled an executive through what is called the Governor and Executive Council. So the Governor and Executive Council was the executive of the old representative system. The Legislative Council was the upper chamber, and the House of Assembly was the lower chamber. But it was an oligarchy. It was limited franchise, extremely limited franchise. And that persisted for most of the slavery years. It was influenced philosophically to some extent by the views on who should have the right to participate in government as against a monarch dominating the entire, or the landed interest dominating the entire apparatus of government.
And so I would say our journey towards a state in which it is acknowledged that sovereignty and power resides in the people, our journey to that state was an incremental one. Our journey to that state, the important landmarks in that journey would be, first of all, the abolition of slavery, because the abolition of slavery was a major step forward once you had a society in which people were divested of all rights and treated as slaves, then that is the very antithesis of a republic of people power. Slavery is abolished in 1838, and by the 1840s, the first black man enters Parliament. Samuel Jackman Prescott. So the black community gets its first taste of exercising parliamentary power, being part of parliament. The rest of our history has to do with agitation to extend the franchise, because to extend the franchise towards universal adult suffrage, which we only achieved in 1950. It was a long journey towards universal adult suffrage, a long journey towards the women getting the vote, but all of these are important milestones in the road towards a republican form of governance in which power resides and sovereignty resides in the people. And that takes us right, of course, you know, the People's Uprising in 1937 was a major contributor to achieving universal adult suffrage.
There are many theories on how to govern a society, and these theories would directly impact on how the masses were represented. Dr. Bell discusses one theory advanced by philosopher John Locke.
The philosopher John Locke was pushing the view, and his views informed very much the American Revolution, that's the American War of Independence. He would have been saying that people that had a stake in society should be given the right to make the decisions about society. And to that extent, that in the context in which he was speaking, that was a democratic development. But it was not democracy in the sense of a majority of the population having the right to vote. What he was really saying was that those who had a stake in society would feel responsible enough to give guidance in a way that you could depend on their judgment. And the other people should be excluded. You could say that Locke's position embryonically would be leading to broadening that representation. It's very difficult to find that kind of propensity within the Barbadian situation. I have said that the Barbadian situation was much closer to what developed eventually in colonies like Rhodesia and South Africa, where the elite in those countries excluded the majority population, and that was seen as something that was permanent, that you would not concede the participation of the rest of the people because that was supposed to be dangerous. If you're talking about the context of Britain, you could say that a struggle within the British political situation might lead eventually to the expansion of the franchise, which happened in the 19th century. That progression towards the end of the 19th century did reach into the Caribbean, but some of the philosophers of the expansion of the franchise within Britain were saying that, in truth, in fact, that should not extend to the colonies. That kind of view of the development of the political system should not extend to the colonies because they weren't ready for it. And that was partly to do with the other expression of that they can trust the people who might inherit it on the basis of numbers.
Remarkably enough, there is movement. This thinking is expanding and gaining root in at least one of our neighboring islands.
That progression was starting to develop in Jamaica in the period immediately after emancipation, where a lot of what was called the colored middle class of Jamaica, some of them were increasingly getting influence in the lower house of the Jamaican old representative system, to the extent that the planters in Jamaica were starting to fear that they might take it over. Well, that persisted until the mid-19th century. And all that time, the debate is going on in Britain as to whether we should retain the old representative system or whether we should impose Crown Colony government, which is direct rule. Crown Colony government is where you take away the assembly and you rule through the governor in executive council, directly from Britain. It is obviously anti-democratic. But the question is whether the superiority of the British culture in relation to Enlightenment compared with the planter culture, whether they would not govern in a way that would give greater feeling to the population. And that was picked up certainly in Barbados by Barbadian masses. Jamaicans were more confident that they could take it over. But in 1865, the Morant Bay Rebellion took place. Paul Bogle and the other Jamaican national hero, from that period. Gordon, two of them were the leading figures in that rebellion. And the planters in Jamaica said, suspend all representative system. And the British said, okay, be glad to do so. And they took it away. So Jamaica went to Crown Colony government. And it looked like if the entire Caribbean would be progressing in that direction to Crown Colony government, therefore direct rule by the British through the governor. And the British were waiting for the opportunities to implement it.
Now what's next? You will realize that this was a careful and calculated approach on the part of the British to bring about Crown Colony government. What was the plan?
In 1875, they sent out Governor John Pope Hennessy to Barbados to deliberately instigate that policy. John Pope Hennessy was an Irishman, and he was seen as a maverick, and he was sent in various parts of the British Empire when they wanted to stir up things, and they sent him to Barbados. And he started a campaign for direct rule from Britain. They were going to link Barbados with the Windward Islands. And it was to say that there would be better administration, it would be more efficient. It even went down to the point of prisons and hospitals, how they would link all of them together and administer them from the center in Barbados. And consequently, that this would improve governance. The planter class in Barbados was very sensitive to the exclusion of them from greater influence in governance. And that, in a sense, goes back almost to the Cromwellian period, where we would see that there was a big battle off Hastings and so on, and off at Old Town, where the people in Barbados were pro-monarchist, and they fought off the Cromwellian forces for a time, and then a compromise was established in which it was agreed that they would maintain their rights as Englishmen overseas and so on, and the old representative system was in place all that time, all down to 1876. Now in 1876, that debate continues. Right? It was never lost by the Barbadian planters. They always were saying, this is our place, we know it better than the British. We should be telling the British how to actually deal with issues here. When these governors come out and try to take charge, they usually make mistakes because they don't know the subtleties of the population, and they don't understand black people like we understand them and so on. You will know that there are some historians that have talked about Barbados being the crucible of racism. And for instance, that concept of lynching people is actually the name of a Barbadian who went up to the Carolinas. And he was a fellow that had a whole philosophy of how you season black people to be able to control them. When they came across from Africa, you would season them into submission. And Barbados was the experiment for that, successful experiment for it. A lot of it was by terror as well, that if you could terrorize people in the way that you had the capacity to do in an institution like slavery, then you could probably inspire tremendous fear in them for generations. And it looked like if it was it would take like 3 generations or 2 generations before people got over the experience of tremendous terror. Then they will try something again. Well, in 1876, that debate in the Barbadian community is continuing, and it really comes about because of the fact that the British are taking advantage of the situation to say, let's bring in Crown Colony government in Barbados and the Windward Islands. So you have a divide. There are some people among the elite that are supporting the governor, but the stronger section are against the governor to preserve the assembly. There are some sections of the colored middle class in Barbados who are supporting the preservation of the assembly. And you can see that they are probably closer to the views of the Jamaican group that had felt that they could take over the assembly. People like Colonel Reeves. His role in the whole thing is celebrated in putting his bust at the top of the stairs in the House of Assembly here. So the divide in terms of the debate goes on, and it becomes violent. So there's actually a rebellion that breaks out now in St. Philip. St. Philip is a place that throws up the rebellions all the time. And actually organize themselves again, just as in 1816, in regiments and so on. So you have a General Green that is playing a big role up in St. Philip in relation to the organizing of the St. Philip forces. They're saying, in support of the governor, we are doing this for Port Hennessy. And the planted militias are fighting against them. And then they bring in, as is the usual thing, they bring in the British forces. And that gives them, of course, advantage. The police don't operate in a very safe way. The matter of fact, said when the police went over to the side of the masses, and some of them sabotaged ammunition and all that kind of thing. But the ultimate result was that the forces, the military forces, particularly of the British, became dominant in the exercise and were able to put down the rebellion. The British, having seen that, they backed off and said that Barbados was special and that they would not seek to push the Crown Colony government thing because it wasn't politically wise to do so, and that they would seek a compromise. And the compromise was the 1881 Executive Committee Act, in which some members of the lower house were allowed to sit in the equivalent of the Executive Council, presumably to advise the governor, or to give them to some kind of concession of respect and so on, and influence in the whole governance structure at the top. So that is what was worked out, and the person that is said to have worked out that was Conor Reeves. And that is where it stayed then in Barbados in relation to the 19th century. So we retain the old representative system. So when Eric Williams says that Barbados had this advantage by going through the experience of a representative system, Barbadians will be saying, we got the planter government imposed on us and retained because the planters defended it, supported by some members of the colored middle class. So that system then remains in place till 1937. And then, of course, you have another revolt.
This revolt is often referred to as the 1937 riots, disturbances, or insurrection. You see the progression, the experiment with Crown Colony government, and how the masses resisted. Let us take a closer look at 1937 and the possible role it played on the road to Republican status.
When I was doing the research on 1937, I came back here in 73 to do that because it wasn't that I was researching 1937. I was looking at the political development of Barbados. My first thesis, my master's thesis, had 1937 as the kind of test site. I was looking at 1937 and what came out of 1937. First of all, the people were ashamed, okay? That's the first thing. I heard a recent one, your program, Bobby Morris talking about romanticizing 1937. No, nothing romantic about 1937 when I was going around Barbados in 1973. All the people were ashamed. All of them were frightened to talk. I eventually found Roland Edwards up in St. Peter, blind, living in a two-story house. Old house ready to come down. And I talked to him downstairs. And he was very cautious at the beginning. And then gradually opened up when he heard the kind of questions I was asking. Okay? And he started to talk more freely. But I found that in a number of the people that I dealt with in 1937, looking for people that were survivors. Shame, don't want to talk. Further, the two political parties had conveniently eased themselves out of this situation of dealing with 1937 for different reasons. The Barbados Labour Party had not done enough work yet around Grantley Adams, because if they had, they wouldn't have been so apologetic. They hadn't done enough work to be confident that if they dealt with 37, that Grantley Adams would not be diminished to the extent that they assumed that he would be by Clement Payne. So they said nothing. They just let it go. Right, excellent, terror. Barno would have been saying, if I go back to 37, he can big up Grantley Adams. So I ain't got nothing to say with 1937 either. Then we came towards the celebration of the 150th anniversary. You see this thing here? This is the third Emancipation, 3 lectures. I was asked to do the 50th anniversary lecture on 37. Between the first year of the 150th anniversary, celebrating through what would be the emancipation periods of 4 years, you have this terror in Barbados. When I did that lecture in Queen's Park, the whole foyer was full of the steel shed. All the steel shed full. People peeping through windows at the side, okay? And the feeling was like electric when I went in there.
But I would call Trafalgar Square Golden Square, and I would put Wickham, O'Neill, and Clement Payne up in Trafalgar Square. And the moment that you call Trafalgar Square Golden Square, Admiral Lord Nelson will have to get down. Because he could not take it, he would turn in his grave that he was standing up in the square of the insurrectionary working class of Barbados.
And everybody in Barbados talking about 1937, then 1937, this and 1937, that and all that. And some people were saying 1937 is our revolution. All up to then, the most of the things like riots. And in that same lecture, you will see that I went through riots, rebellion, revolution, and broke it down. Okay? And he did that deliberately to answer that discussion that was going on. I said it wasn't a revolution, but it wasn't a riot neither. It was a rebellion. And the work that has been done by those younger historians now that you have pulled up your program, the empirical work that they have done, it confirmed to me that it was an insurrection. You know, that it's all over the place and very, very, very thing. And not only that, then Woodville Marshall had done some work as well, which in relation to Payne, which I could only speculate on at the time, because when I went in the archives at that time, they want me to touch certain things. The terror did not manifest itself fully in 1937, but the history of the oppression of black people is the use of terror, because don't want to make a statement that coming in close to coming to be racist, but 1-to-1, okay? A lot of races in the world fear black people, that they feel that if you tackle them 1-to-1, you can get beat. And that is feared by people who then operate on the basis of herd. You come together and use the force of the herd to oppress. And that force of the herd has been used to terrorize black people in their oppression. Now, I heard another thing in your program, they talk about the 60-year thing, right? I said that in 1987 in my lecture. If you read at the back of the lecture, you hear me saying that every 60 years there's something in Barbados, so y'all could expect for the next 60. I didn't know how it was going to manifest itself. It manifested itself in the fall of Erskine Sanford and the rise of Owen Arthur. Okay? Because the society had changed to that extent, so it wasn't a riot, right? But if you count from 1816, 1876, 1937, you can see 60 years, okay? And if you check that, it's 2 generations. Some people say 3. It is when the memory of the terror has started to slide off. And then people open up again, okay? 37, it is terror. People get shot down. Now, not as bad as what happened in 1816.
The disturbances of 1937 proved to be a symbol of frustration regarding the lack of political representation as well as social and economic conditions. This unrest led to the establishment of what is commonly referred to as the Dean and the Moines Commission. These commissions were tasked with investigating and reporting on the situation while providing solutions.
People don't know very much about the Dean Commission, but the Dean Commission was appointed by the then government to look at and report on local conditions. And this preceded the Moines Commission, which substantiated lots of the findings of the Dean Commission. And what did they find? They found that conditions were so bad for the majority in Barbados. People had most no running water, pit toilets, and some shared between families, small and dilapidated dwellings, persons working on plantations, having to pay rent for living there, and they could be removed at any time if they withheld their labor from the plantations. educational standard that was so low, very few children of the majority were in school or for very short periods. Children were also having to work in the fields with their parents. Things were bad. And it was not just because or at the time of the 37 riots that this became so. As you would have known, or you may not know, I did substantial research on the history of Barbados and other colonies when I was doing research on migration to Panama. And conditions for Barbadians and in other countries as well were no different than they were before emancipation. In Barbados, it was particularly bad because of the large population and the fact that there was no land available for Barbadians to buy. Not until the planters at the turn of the century sold off some plantation lands. So mainly our ancestors were living in very poor conditions. And the British government would have known that going back from the latter part of the 19th century. But it was not until the Dean and the Moines Commission highlighted these facts that anything was done. And why was action taken then? The Second World War was looming. The Great Depression was just coming to an end. And it had had even more disastrous effects on poverty in Barbados than before. So how did the British government respond? They allocated, I think it was £1 million over 20 years to all of the colonies in the Caribbean that would assist in bettering the lot of persons. And this included instructions to the governments to remove as many of the slum conditions as they could, better education, I said this before, but something I didn't remember to say, is that the Moines Commission recommended that women, as long as they had the qualifications, should be employed in government and in any jobs for which they had the qualifications and the aptitudes. And this was one of the first times we were seeing in the region that such a recommendation was made. And I mentioned earlier that the Moines Commission report led to further developments that affected conditions in the colony. Mind you, they did not recommend self-government, or they didn't think the colonies were ready. And certainly the British government was not at that time ready to relinquish any of its authority in the region. But over the next few years, bit by bit, it happened.
The Moines Commission report makes for very interesting reading as it recognized the plight of the people back then and offered recommendations to improve their standard of living. Then, in 1977, 40 years after the 1937 insurrection, Prime Minister the Honorable Tom Adams summarized the events which led to the unrest and declared July 26 as a day of national significance.
Mr. Speaker, sir, today marks the 40th anniversary of a significant event in the history of Barbados, a day which has been declared by the government to be a day of national significance.
Good afternoon.
The night of July the 26th, 1937,
Tom Adams,
saw the beginning of a revolt that lasted for several days, spreading from Bridgetown to the rural areas of the country. The people rose in protest against the hardship and privation they suffered during the hungry 30s of the present century. Before the uprising was suppressed, 14 people were killed, 47 were injured, and 453 were arrested and imprisoned. The Great Crusade that was advocated by O'Neill and brought sharply to our attention by the explosion of 1937 has the support and cooperation of all those who love this country. It is because we are serenely confident of the maturity of our people, because we are profoundly convinced of their wisdom and common sense, that this government resolved that the day when the poor and underprivileged rose in rebellion against intolerable living conditions should be recognized as a day of national significance.
So, there's the expansion of the voting franchise as we progress into the 1950s. Dr. Bell continues by discussing a new concept for the region where elected representatives can now sit in cabinet in an effort to ensure the masses are involved in the decision-making process.
It is that whole representative system that then goes into, you had some expansion of the franchise then too, at the time of the 1881 Executive Committee. You had some expansion of the franchise at the point of the emancipation, and just before, so that there's some movement of the franchise over the century and into the 20th century. But essentially, it's still a small number of people that are already participating. So the real involvement of large numbers of people in voting comes in the 1950s, in the early 1950, 51, when you get the Adult Suffrage Act. And that allows Grantley Adams to consolidate his position, although he's already penetrating that by the 40s, he and Winter Crawford. And the British are facilitating the change by moving the old representative system towards ministerial government. So the Bush experiment of 1946 is an attempt to bring some of the elected members of the House, including the leaders of Labour, into the executive. So Adams is allowed to propose people to go and sit in the executive committee with the governor. He names, for instance, at that time, Hugh Springer, who was more or less his lieutenant in the House of Assembly. Winter Crawford is seen as more problematic by the British. And you'll see that trend in the Caribbean, right through the Caribbean, that probably for different reasons and with different nuances, different people are favored and not favored by the British. In Jamaica, for instance, they in a sense were confused about who to favor, because Norman Manley was an Oxford scholar and so on, Jamaica scholar, lawyer and all that, but he was seen as a social democrat. And if you wanted to wipe him with a broader thing, to say he's a socialist, okay? And that he was more radical in relation to the People's National Party. The People's National Party is really the model party for the rest of the Caribbean in relation to organizing at the constituency-based annual conferences, ideology and all that. And a lot of other parties modeled themselves on the People's National Party. There was a left wing in the People's National Party that was even Marxist. Okay? So the British had a slight concern about Manley in that respect. No matter that he was this scholar from Oxford and Rhodes Scholar and all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, you had Bustamante, who was semi-literate, but from the brown class of Jamaica. Almost, if you see Bustamante, he looked really white. He was a charismatic figure. He controlled some of the more difficult parts of Kingston, and he had the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union behind him. He had contempt for any cultural preferences that the British had in relation to political organization and trade union organization. The very reason why he called the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union is because he was spitting in the face of the British. The British increasingly had told people in the colonies that they should keep the politics out of the unions. And at a certain point when they were starting to bring more people into ministerial responsibility, they said there should be a divide. So that they had advised that the political leadership take themselves out of the union leadership. Grantley Adams followed it to a T. So he came out of the Barbados Workers Union as leader. At one time he was leader of the Barbados Workers Union and the Barbados Labour Party. And that is when Frank Walker took over. But in a sense it came on because Adams was saying, let's follow the British and concede that we split the leadership issue. Bustamante told him that he wasn't splitting no leadership issue in terms of the trade union. And one of the songs that the Jamaican workers that were members of the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union used to sing was that we would follow Bustamante till he died. There was no way that Bustamante was not going to be the leader of the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union. But then he was used as a balance against the former radicalism of Manley. So you had that divide in Jamaica. If you went to Trinidad, Uriah Butler, he had emerged as the dominant trade union leader in Trinidad, and he had his political party as well. and the British were suspicious of him. So they favored Gomes as an alternative to Butler, and more or less had that counter within the context of Trinidad as well. And in Barbados, they favored Adams against Crawford in relation to who they felt they could work with better, because Crawford was a bit of a hard one to handle. He didn't have the kind of coolness of Adams, but he also had a way of being able to incite that Adams would not have engaged in. And the two of them were rivals in the 1940s for leadership of the labor movement. Adams won out. Eventually, Crawford then joined forces with the so-called Young Turks that broke away from the Barbados Labour Party and formed the Democratic Labour Party. Now, it meant that Barbados is developing a ministerial form of government that is happening in other places as well. But it's also our ministerial experience is developing adult suffrage. When these things come together, it is really saying that you are moving towards what was called in the colonial literature full internal self-government.
The desire for internal self-governance has been observed in the Caribbean throughout the decades. This took shape in a regional federalist movement over 60 years ago.
There was always an independence train in Barbados. So you had it from the side of the enslavers, the Barbadian planters saying that they are Englishmen overseas. And then eventually you have it from Prescott coming right through to Barra. So that's true in the 19th century into Barra, where Prescott is saying, what do you expect that we wanted? You think we were just to leave the thing in your hands? And so on. And but he had tried to do it via a colonial union of the West Indies, where he was linking with other people in the West Indian Islands, went as far as Jamaica and so on to try to build that party. It was his liberal party extending itself outwards. That, you could say, was taken up in the 40s by the movement for federation. So the way in which it was seen, again, is consistent with what I just said about Prescott, is that through federal union, you would have a state that was viable enough to proceed to independence. And the British had partly bought into that, especially after the World War II, when they realized that they're going to let go of the empire and so on. So you have that movement to federation in the 1940s, and Grantley Adams is playing a prominent role in it. So is Norman Manley. And then move into the 50s. At that point, somebody like Eric Williams is emerging, and the federation is going to come in 58. It's going to last for only 4 years. And domestic politics starts to play a role in there again, because Norman Manley was really the leader of the Federal Labour Party. At that time, fellas used to come into different countries and speak and all that type of thing. My father has told me how he heard Bustamante speaking in Queen's Park. Okay? So it wasn't strange for them to come into an island somewhere else and talk and so on. And Adams used to go up to Jamaica, Manley would come down here and all that kind of stuff. So you have this federal movement, right? And Manley was supposed to be the person with the greatest prestige in the Caribbean to go forward in this way, but he had Bustamante as a rival. And Bustamante would be pro-federal one day and anti-federal the next day, depending on where the politics was going. And he essentially took a position when he saw that Manley was being tied into the federal thing to go anti-federal. There was also a class division in Jamaica as well. The Jamaican middle class and the more educated people in Jamaica were pro-federation. We say that in a loose and general way, but I think that is accurate to say that. And the big interests that supported the Jamaica Labour Party and the masses of Jamaica in terms of the peasantry and agricultural workers, they didn't know much about the Eastern Caribbean anyhow. So Bustamante created this image of a big fat pig with a whole lot of little piglets sucking at Jamaica and that is what was going to happen in the Federation. Okay? And a lot of people bought that. And eventually, when they had the referendum on the Federation, he beat Manley. And then Manley lost the general election, and Bustamante became the Prime Minister. Before that, 58-62, Adams becomes Prime Minister, the first and the last Prime Minister of the Federation. If you read Eric Williams' Inward Hunger, one of the things that he covers is his view of federation. And he was for a unitary state. So he wanted a federal government that would not be too overburdened in the debate that you always have in a federation. They had it in the United States. How much states' rights you should have and how much federal rights you should have. It goes on in the United States up to now. Well, we had that debate in the West Indies too. How strong should be the state rights of Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad as against the federal rights? Eric Williams was on the side of a strong central government. The Jamaicans more cautious of that, because if you touch Jamaica at all, you would know that Jamaican nationalism is extremely strong. Okay, and I don't think they would want to surrender much to any federal government. But on the other hand, if you look at the Federation of Nigeria, you will notice that when the Federation goes into crisis, and the United States, because when they had their civil war, it is you have to have the strongest states have to be able to dominate the survival of the Federation. So if you have the weaker states on the side that is saying save the Federation usually breaks up. Jamaica was the strongest state in the West Indies Federation, and Jamaica was saying we're ready to come out, and the Federation broke up. So those are some of the reasons why you have to be very careful how you see this progression. But there's a progression to say come together, and that is the right way to go from the 19th century. And sometimes it would swing one way or swing the next way. And you had different visions of how it would unite that thing. I believe that if we had a federal government under S.A. Eric Williams, that we would have gone republic pretty early. If you had it under Norman Manley, you probably would have held on to the monarchy, because of, not that he was pro-monarchist, although he was an Anglophile, not that he was so much pro-monarchist as he was cautious. And he would have felt, because he faced reality, that, you know, the people will come with you because they're accustomed to this thing. And that if we try to do more, that you might get resistance. Or that you get people that can manipulate a difference, which is the other factor that you have to take into account. If somebody can engage now with a population that is not sophisticated enough to see what they're doing, and that would break up the unity, okay? And you have a Bustamante. That's what he did to break up the Federation. He intervened, knowing that he was charismatic, that a lot of Jamaicans would follow him, and he would win the government from Manley if he was successful, and he did so. We know too that, you know, that when Grant Adams was there as Prime Minister of the Federation, he was losing his base in Barbados. Barrack came through and took over in '61 before the end of the Federation and became the Premier of Barbados. The only one that survived was Eric Williams. So Eric Williams, though, as I said, he probably was the best person to become Prime Minister, but he didn't have the cultural links with the Federal Labour Party that somebody like a Norman Manley or Grant Adams would have had. And the two of them, being of a slightly different generation, were also a bit suspicious of him. They were also, I think, suspicious of them and other West Indians of what is perceived as a Trinidadian propensity to dominate. Okay? And it was fully expressed in Williams on the basis of his great confidence that he knew what was necessary and that he would run it effectively. And that would have held up things a bit. But otherwise, I think we would have gone to more a unity federation, strong central government, Eric Williams as Prime Minister, and if you follow what happened with Trinidad, we probably would have gone to Republican status.
And that takes us right up to independence in 1966, where we say to the British, look, we have had enough of colonial domination. We have had enough of the British colonial governor having so much power over our affairs, the British colonial governor acting on behalf of the monarch of England. And we now want our independence, so we want to take another step forward on the road towards a system in which power and sovereignty resides in the people.
Just remember that with independence, when we were discussing independence again, we would go through each of the territories that went to independence first in the West Indies. And that would essentially be Jamaica, Trinidad, and then Barbados, Guyana. They didn't treat Guyana so much, but in the case of Jamaica, what I said about Norman Manley, that was said. Then in the case of Trinidad, they said that Eric Williams, and knowing Eric Williams with his big ego, and they bited everybody else, you know. Eric Williams identified one man to design the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. And he said, when that fellow designs it, we will critically look at it. That is how he approached it. The Jamaicans put together a committee, and a lot of them discussed then what should go in. And they had some strange resistance, especially from some of the planter interests and so on. There are the Ashenimes, for instance, told Manley and Bustamante that they had to put in special clauses to protect their property, okay? And Bustamante himself was saying, but if this constitution is sovereign, and Bustamante is the more conservative, even if this constitution is sovereign, we shouldn't be doing that. But they conceded to them. Okay? In Barbados, Errol Barrow said, I represent the people of Barbados. The cabinet of Barbados represents the people of Barbados. The cabinet of Barbados doesn't make the constitution. And essentially that is what happened. But when they went to England and so on, I had the committee and all that as well, you know. But it was essentially that Barrow decided what would be the constitution in Barbados, along with the cabinet of Barbados, and he legitimized it by saying the people of Barbados had elected him to govern Barbados, and we're going to independence.
So we now become independent as a constitutional monarchy. So
my view is that we have a government now that is sufficiently popular on the basis of the last election, that if it declared in that period that it was going to, for a qualitative constitutional change in terms of what it considers to be improving governance, that it has every right to do so. And I believe that just for practical political purposes, you could say, let us do it in a way that it will not cause unnecessary tension and problems in the community that might delay the whole process or even cause it to be postponed again. So if once you take that into account, my conclusion would be, go minimalist, use it as a precursor, and then do reforms down the road in relation to governance.
Similar to his beliefs, Prime Minister Motley on July 26, 2021, revealed Barbados will indeed become a parliamentary republic, with a president who will serve for a term of 4 years. The Prime Minister also revealed other changes to the Constitution will be made following November 30th, with extensive public consultation.
Well, Rashid, that brings us to the end of Road to Republic. Thank you for your time. Tune in to the next program as we discuss our current system of governance. Until then, I am Miles Eversley.
And I'm Rashid Best. See you next time.